All right, it is now 10 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. I am Aaron Blumberg, Swiftland's Continuing Education Coordinator, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this morning's webinar, S is for Stereotypes. This is the sixth in the DDI, which is Diversity Discovery Institute webinar series. We have a wonderful learning opportunity ready for you this morning with Ms. Linda Bruno. Linda has been developing and conducting training workshops for libraries and other organizations for more than 15 years. She offers workshops on topics ranging from leadership skills to returning balance and lots of areas in between. Linda received her MBA from the University of Florida and has years of experience in hands-on management positions. She develops her workshops based on solid research and, more importantly, real-life application. Linda is also certified with DDI and Achieve Global. Please welcome Linda and enjoy her webinar this morning. Linda?
Thank you so much, Aaron, and welcome everybody. Before we get started, I know that several of you at least have been at several of the Diversity Discovery Institute programs that we've had in the past, but I wanted to just touch on what we've covered so far just to kind of refresh our memory and see how that ties into today's program. Our very first webinar was about differences and the diversity of differences in our library environment, whether that be with our coworkers, our supervisors, our patrons, anybody that we interacted with. There is a diversity of differences. And we started out by talking about the very basic ones like race and culture and ethnicity and gender and age, but we also dug a little deeper and talked about introverts versus extroverts. We talked about personalities, whether maybe you lived in a rural area or a city area growing up, all kinds of things, even your life stage, whether you're single, married, children, grandchildren, non-children, whatever it might be. Just to kind of get us thinking about that is what diversity is all about. And then the next session was on you as an individual and how we have to recognize our own individuality, but also the individuality of other people. There are no two people alike, even twins. I'm just going to do a little aside here. I don't know if you saw the news this morning that Sawyer Sweeten from Everybody Loves Raymond at 19 years old committed suicide. So he was a twin, and you think, gosh, what a shame that one person in that environment was struggling with something, and they haven't said, but that's how different we are. We are as unique as snowflakes, as so many people like to say. Then we talked about values. We talked about how to energize your workplace using diversity. We talked about respecting people based on diversity, and today, of course, we're going to talk about stereotypes. If you look at your first slide, you will notice a stereotype that's been around about librarians forever. I think maybe since The Sound of Music. Wasn't it The Sound of Music, Marian the Librarian? I may be on the wrong path there, but I think that was the musical that Marian the Librarian was in. And it was a stereotype. Oh, Music Man, thank you. Music Man, yes, of course, Sound of Music was The Hills Are Alive. So yes, thank you. The Music Man, you're right. You are all right. Thank you so much. But it's a stereotype, isn't it? I can remember on a King of Queens show where Carrie was wearing her hair up in a bun, and Doug kept saying, you look like a librarian. And when they went to a reunion, they were honoring the librarian at the school, and they showed a picture of her from the side with her hair up in a bun, and Carrie was appalled that she was wearing her hair like that. But that's kind of the stereotype that society has put on us, and that goes along with the fact that we also stereotype people, don't we? We don't do it consciously, I don't believe. We just grow up with it. We do stereotyping because sometimes it's a shortcut to something, and that's what we're going to discuss today. So the first thing on your handouts, if you have them available, and a link for those came with your email reminding you of this program. Let's take a look at number A, or letter A, on your handouts. If you look it up, and there are several different definitions, but the word stereotype says to believe unfairly that all people or things with a particular characteristic are the same. Unfairly, I think, is a little harsh maybe, but unrealistically might be a better word. We believe unrealistically that all people or things with a particular characteristic are the same, because they're not, ever. It seems like to me. I can't think of a group of human beings where you could lump all of them into one characteristic, except to say that they're all human beings. That would be, I guess you could call that a stereotype if you wanted. But that's what we need to think of in our library environment, isn't it? That when our minds go to a stereotype accidentally, inadvertently, we're not being fair to the other person. And in order to be fair, we need to step back from that. And I want you to think about that as we go through today's program, you personally. Not how somebody else in your library treats people, not how you've been treated in another library or anything like that, but how you interact with people based on stereotypes, so that you're gut-wrenching honest with yourself, if you will, about how you instinctively think about certain groups of people or certain people that come in because they belong to a certain group. I wanted to just start with something fun this time because this is going to be kind of a heavy topic. So I was searching for some common stereotypes. Just type your answer into the chat box if you can think of the nationality with the highest alcohol consumption. Who do we think that is? Irish, Anthony says, that is the Russian and Polish, you're getting a little closer. Irish is the most common answer. And actually, it's Belarus, which I think is over by Eastern Europe, maybe more connected to the Polish or the Russians, or Luli says the Cuba is probably not. But oftentimes we do think is the Irish is a hard drinking, partying, non-working kind of a people, and that's not true for a whole bunch of Irish people. But that's a stereotype. How about the gender that's the best at problem solving? What does society tell us? Janet, I like that. Yeah, the females are all going to say that, but society tells us that men are problem solvers, doesn't it? And yet there's no proof to that. They've done study after study that if you give them problems, both sexes can solve problems. So there's really no proof, but we've been brought up to believe that. The next one is exactly the same. Gender that is the most nurturing, we are told it's females. Society encourages it to be females and encourages males not to do that because of the stereotyping they will be presented with. And there's no proof that the female is more nurturing, although it does appear to a lot of us that way because that's where society kind of guides us, isn't it? And if you think about stereotypes, that's where society guides us on a lot of stereotypes. How about the gender that allows emotions to influence decisions? Lily says guys all the way on that one, and a lot of people will tell you it's females, and that's one of the reasons they say they don't want females in top management positions is because they will be too emotional. And it's not true. Again, when you start researching these things, you find there are no studies that show that. There is nothing to show that except that people's perceptions over the years have determined that females are more emotional. I think what might be happening is that females tend to show their emotions more. But I know a lot of males that have shown emotions in the workplace or have used emotions in a bad way, influencing decisions in the workplace, and it just wasn't as obvious. The generation that has a sense of entitlement, we've all heard that time and time again. We think that's millennials. Okay, Janet says Generation X, and I think they are stereotyped into being the generation that's, I'm going to say cynical, skeptical, and yet there are a lot of people in that generation that aren't cynical and aren't skeptical, and there are a lot of people in other generations that are, and so it's stereotyping again. The millennials have been given somewhat of a bad rap because they are always told they have a sense of entitlement, and really it comes down to a lot of times it's a higher expectation from them of what they expect out of life and out of their jobs and out of their social interactions and so forth. The most aggressive dog breed. There's a fun one for you. Most people would say, as a stereotype, pit bulls, would they? They used to say Dobermans. They've also said German Shepherds in the past. Yorkies are fairly aggressive. You're right, absolutely. Yes, pit bull is the stereotype, but actually the most aggressive is a dachshund. They have studied that. They have statistics on that. And the dachshunds are actually more aggressive. And when you look at the two different dogs. I have a friend that just absolutely thinks every pit bull in the world should be put to sleep because she has heard this stereotype over and over. I have another friend that has a pit bull that is the sweetest baby in the world. So again, stereotyping, as silly as it sounds to put dog breeds into a webinar about library environments, it helps us understand how easy it is to stereotype. Hair color of those who tend to be ditzy was always blonde, whether it was real blonde or fake blonde, it didn't matter. Blondes have always been taking the hit for that. And if you've ever watched Shark Tank and you've seen Lori Greiner on there, you know that's not true. Those who protect us and also eat lots of donuts are the police, of course. And, you know, where are they going to get their donut if they're on a break? Other than stopping at the donut shop. And of course, there are going to be dozens of people that see them there, so that's how that stereotype takes over. Well, that's an interesting comment about the dachshunds breed to attack and kill badgers. Huh. Very possible. The state whose citizens love to wear cowboy boots and 10-gallon hats, we assume, is Texas, and there are lots of western states that actually do that. So I just wanted to kind of let us see that it's not just in our interactions with other people that we make stereotypes, but it's in our entire lives. And that's why it's so difficult to get away from it when we are interacting with people, because it's a normal thing to do. And we all do it, whether we admit it or not. We may not do it loudly or vocally or obviously, but the thoughts are there sometimes. I see the comment about Luli wearing cowboy boots and 10-gallon hats to work all the time. Okay, so I just wanted to give you those ideas about stereotyping to let you see that we all do it. B says people use stereotypes to make decisions about people. That's when it becomes an issue, isn't it? Because if I'm making a stereotype decision, then I'm not considering you as an individual. If there is, let's just take age as one of the very diverse differences that we talked about at the very beginning of this Discovery Institute. When you talk about age, you can stereotype the older people that come into your library, and a lot of you deal with older people in your library, as being cranky, as not paying attention, as being technologically challenged, and all of those things. And those are all stereotypes, aren't they? But you make decisions about how you're going to treat them and how you're going to interact with them based on their age. I often go out in public and have somebody call me honey or sweetie. I guess, exactly, Anna. Her mom is 92 and a computer whiz. And I bet if somebody that didn't know Anna's mom, excuse me, came up to her to talk to her about using the computer, they would almost pat her on the head, as if not only does she not know about the computer, she's probably not very bright. Somehow that kind of goes hand in hand these days. And that's a stereotype that's totally unfair. But we do that too. We make decisions about the kids that come into our libraries. We make decisions about maybe the single moms that bring their kids in. We make decisions about the older people, the people that struggle with English as a first language. We make decisions without really realizing that's what we're doing. And we're here today to bring up our sense of awareness. That's all. Not for me to beat you up, because I'd have to be beating myself up at the same time. I'm human, just like everybody in this room today. And those thoughts come into my mind, and I have to be aware of them. I have to use my emotional intelligence, which is self-awareness. And then I have to self-manage what those thoughts are and how I interact with that person. Those are two key points of emotional intelligence that we've touched on in a couple of the other programs. If you're thinking about Daniel Goleman's model of emotional intelligence, the first piece of that is self-awareness. That's what we're here for today. I'm trying to make you self-aware. Again, please don't put a barrier up today and think, well, none of this applies to me, because I'm pretty sure it applies to almost everybody. Even the people that work really hard at it not applying to them, they may stereotype different groups than we even thought of, because they've tried so hard to avoid the main ones or the most common ones, but yet they fall into that trap as well. And the second piece, as I said, of emotional intelligence is, okay, now I'm aware that I do that. I'm aware of the emotions it brings up inside me when I do that. What am I going to do to manage my emotions? That's the first two pieces of emotional intelligence. That's what determines how we're going to make a decision about that person we're interacting with. It's our emotion, isn't it? How we interact with that person is based on the emotion we feel at the time. If we can at least, let's say, lessen our tendency to stereotype, then our first thoughts might be, great, here comes somebody I can help, and we have a whole different attitude about the decision we're going to make about how we interact with them, whether they need to use the copier, whether they need to research something, whether they need to get on the computer, and what if they don't have any computer skills? We still aren't going to stereotype them. So it has to do with making decisions. The negative stereotypes are the ones that get us in trouble, aren't they? They prevent people from seeing others as individuals. And as I mentioned, everybody is as individual as their fingerprints or snowflakes. We've always heard, and I never know how they really determine this because they melt so quick, but every snowflake is different. We know that every person is different. And negative stereotypes don't allow us to see that. We just lump them all together. I remember for years when I was growing up, I have red hair, and the negative stereotype in my family, and it was half joking, was that redheads are bullheaded. That was the term that was used, and I grew up thinking that about myself. And I will go right there with you that I am a bit stubborn, but it actually is based more on my personality than anything, but it was always perceived as a negative until I got out of school and I started working in the real world. Happened to have a supervisor who said, you know what, she's very determined, she's very persistent, we can use this for a positive, and all of a sudden I saw that that quote bullheadedness that I'd been stereotyped with could actually be something for good. So it prevented my parents and my family from seeing me as somebody who might be able to do something with that, and they just lumped me into, she's a redhead, she's bullheaded. That's the way she always is. She wants to be alone just because she's stubborn, and I was an introvert. So those stereotypes I carried those with me throughout my years of elementary and high school, and it wasn't a positive experience. So think of the people coming into your library right now, sitting here this morning. Think of a couple of people, 3, 4 people that you would recognize if they came into your library, or your coworkers, and think how easily you could stereotype them into a box that they might not belong into. And that's going to be a negative thing probably for them. So we want to be careful of that. Now, I'm going to now be devil's advocate. When might it actually be beneficial or helpful to think in terms of a stereotype? Can you give me an example in the library? When might it actually help your library environment if you kind of thought in terms of this group is this, that group is this? Give me an example of that. I see Janet is typing, so I'm going to wait a second and see what she's typing to us, and Tony is typing. I think we'll have some examples popping up, and I don't want to talk over it. Yes, exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking of, Tony. You target programming, don't you? If you didn't, quote, stereotype in those instances, you would be offering gardening programs to the 9th graders. Not that that might not be a good thing to do, because there might be certain instances where you would want to do that, but certainly something involving video games or something like that would probably be more interesting and more enticing, wouldn't it? So you're going to target programming based on stereotypes. Another reason it makes it so difficult for us to not stereotype in other situations, because it's very common and very logical for us to stereotype when we are targeting programming. And Janet says when we're speaking to families of Spanish heritage, it's better to direct the conversation at the father or male. Ah, yes, we understand that that's what's respected. So we need to understand that there are times that this is helpful to us. And I didn't want you to leave today thinking, I can never try to group people into a group because that's a bad thing to do. I'm not supposed to stereotype. Well, you're not supposed to stereotype in a negative manner, but certainly you're going to want to use the information you have about those people to make their experience with your library a better thing, right? So that's when it's going to be helpful. If you're thinking in terms of, gosh, teen boys like blah, blah, blah. Elementary children like blah, blah, blah. That's how you're going to make your decisions. The risk becomes elementary children always run through the library. Uh-oh, we just turned that group into a negative stereotype, didn't we? When I was going through dog obedience training with my dog, I wanted him to be a therapy dog, so we went to obedience classes. And we went to one class. He had been abused for 3 years before I adopted him, and I suspect that part of the abuse came from young children because of the way he's interacted with them since then. But we were at one class, and there were two boys over on the other side of the store, and they were romping and jumping on the shelving and everything else, and we were supposed to be walking around the store, and he would not go to that side of the store. And I thought, we are in for a real challenge when he takes his AKC Good Canine Citizen test, because he obviously doesn't like those kids. And she told us she was going to have kids as part of the test because a therapy dog has to be able to interact with children, even though we were going to go to nursing homes. So it came time for the test, and she had a friend who had a daughter and a son, and they came as part of the test, but they were totally different kids. I was so worried that, oh, they're going to be young kids and they're going to be too hyperactive and all of this stuff, and they were very polite, very calm, very easy to interact with, and the dog just walked right past them like they're just people, and yet he wouldn't go to the other side of the store. So it can really, I did the stereotyping thing. I thought, oh, the kids are going to be a problem in this test because of the exhibit that I had seen the week before from a different set of kids. So again, even though it's helpful, then we have to stop it there, don't we, Tony? We have to say, okay, we targeted the programming, but we aren't going to assume that they're all going to behave this way, that they're all going to be disrespectful, that they're all going to run through the library, or whatever it might be. We have to stop after we've given the positive focus of stereotyping. Then we have to stop and say, now I don't want to take this any further and assume that they're all going to be the same. Within the workplace, stereotypes prevent the use of an individual's talents. You see the female here working those equations. I've got to tell you, the first line is beyond me. It's the it's the STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and math. I'm not naturally talented at that, but I know women who are, lots of women who are, and I'm thrilled for them, but it's a struggle for them to actually move up in that world because the stereotype is they can't possibly understand math. They can't possibly understand engineering or technology or science. I have a friend I graduated from high school with who was a science teacher, and I always thought, ew, why would you want to do that? That's what she was good at. It was her talent. If you've ever watched Big Bang Theory, Amy on Big Bang Theory is the only one that in real life has a terminal degree. She has a PhD, I believe, in neuroscience. So it's not as if she's this fluffy little actress person like we would normally stereotype her. Because if you go to Hollywood and you're an actor or an actress, you must be out in La La Land. That's why it's LA, right? La La Land. But actually, she's an extremely bright person in areas that I could not even come close to competing on. And the reverse is true as well, isn't it? There are men who are very good at the softer skills, leading people, encouraging people. They're great leaders. They're very nurturing. And so when we stereotype them one way or the other, we prevent using their actual talents. Can you think of an example where you've seen that happen? Maybe not in your library, but maybe it's happened to you or somebody you know, where somebody stereotyped somebody and didn't see their actual talent. For instance, what Anna was saying with her mom at 92. She obviously has an individual talent of really glomming onto whatever is going on with technology. Can you think of another example where we maybe have prevented the use of an individual's talents because we stereotype them? I see some typing going on. The more we can apply this to what's going on in our own library environments or what we've witnessed in the past or what we know somebody else has gone to, the more real it becomes to us and the more likely we are to be aware of it when we actually leave today's workshop. Anna says speaking louder to non-English speakers. Isn't that funny? We think that speaking louder will make them understand English. I don't know quite why we think that, but the talent is not in their hearing. The talent is they're going to be attentive enough to pay attention to us. So we tend to prevent the use of individuals' talents based on a stereotype. Let's say we hire a young person who's just bubbly and excited and really good at what they're expressing to us, and so we put them in the children's area for story time because of that. Maybe the real talent would lie in marketing and outreach. Maybe just because they're bubbly and outgoing and love to tell stories, maybe they really don't interact with children that well, but we assume they do. We stereotype that they do. Instead of sending them out to the chamber and the corporations in our community and the mothers of preschoolers to gather them into our library, we put them out into the children's section and they're not really happy there. But we've stereotyped them based on how they are perceived from their personality. Among supervisors and staff, and this is very important today, you are part of that one side or the other of that equation. Stereotyping can lead to what? What do you think? Fill in the blank. There are no right or wrong answers. I just wrote down what came to my mind as I was developing this program. So what do you think? If there's stereotyping among supervisors and staff, what happens? I see typing going on. That's good. Wrong assignments, absolutely, because we are, again, stereotyping that this would be the best assignment for you. There are communication issues because we are making assumptions based on who you are or what your background is about how we should communicate with you. Even to the point where I think at one time we talked about, in one of these diverse differences things, we talked about communication as far as auditory, visual, kinesthetic, and we assume most people might be in this group or that group, and yet there's a miscommunication, or as Anthony says, a misunderstanding, because we've lumped people into that group, haven't we? We create those roadblocks. That's a good way of saying that, Jan. We create roadblocks because our mind is already made up. That's how you can look at stereotyping. We've already made up our mind. And a lack of teamwork. I'm not going to put you on my team because I assume you're XYZ because of this. Anna says catalogs are anal and have no people skills. Absolutely. Or the IT people. They think the same thing about IT people. We lump them into that group. There may be some out there. That's how stereotypes happen. However, there may be more than that that are not like that. And we make those assumptions, and then there is tension. There is lower productivity. There is low morale because we're being judged as something. I know that when I was in the corporate world, and I was in the corporate world for many years, first as a staff person, then as a supervisor, but I was female in a very male-dominated company and a very male-dominated industry. At one point, I was in charge of purchasing in a male-dominated industry, and I would go to trade shows where 98% of the people I was interacting with were men, and back then, the stereotypes were so obvious of what they were lumping me into that I had a very difficult time dealing with those people. So we created roadblocks. There wasn't teamwork as far as vendor to buyer. There wasn't any of that because they couldn't get beyond the stereotype of a female being in that position. That wasn't supposed to be. So we need to be careful of that because it can lead to low morale in our workplace, tensions, as I mentioned, poor service. If our supervisors and staff are interacting based on assumptions, which are also stereotypes, then our patrons are not going to get the service they need, are they? Because maybe we haven't assigned things the way we should. Maybe there's that tension going on and the patron feels that. So we're giving poor service based on our stereotyping of our own staff. We have retention issues. I eventually left because of the male-female disconnect at the company I worked for. It was the best thing I ever did. I got to do this, and I'm thrilled about that. But at the time, it was crushing for me because I could not break into that domain, if you will. We've all heard about the glass ceiling. I used to joke that I had an acrylic ceiling where I worked because I would get to the top and bounce off of it. And I knew that that was never going to happen, and I left. So that was a retention issue. It's still the same there. Many talented female workers have left because they've gotten discouraged by the stereotyping. So retention issues can be a problem. And in the library, it might be almost reverse stereotyping or reverse discrimination, if you will, because we know that males are not as well represented in the library environment, and they probably feel the stereotype from other people that when patrons come in, the stereotype is the library will be full of females. So it can happen both ways. And the retention issue can become an issue for both parties. And as somebody said, lack of teamwork. Janet said teamwork issues. Because if you're going to lump me there, I might as well behave that way and not put forth my best effort. So there's a teamwork issue. And G says, when a person makes stereotype assumptions, we start to look for things to confirm our beliefs. It's called confirmation bias. If I think this about men, that's what I'm going to see, isn't it? If I think all men are discriminatory, let's say, then when I go work with a male on a program, I'm going to be looking for signs of discrimination, aren't I? We all have this confirmation bias thing. When we have a certain thought process about something and we're convinced of that thought process, that's what we look for the next time we interact with that person. It may be there, but it may be so far overwhelmed by something totally opposite in their personality that they're really, really trying to be inclusive of women or inclusive of this group or inclusive of that group. And yet, because there's that one little comment they made, and how many of you agree with me, just raise your hand if you do, that our media is making every little comment we make about stereotypes now? Do you agree with that? It just seems like they're almost promoting us to feel bad about anything anybody says nowadays. You say one word about anything, and it might even seem complimentary. You might have felt it was complimentary. Thank you all for raising your hands. I see many of you did. You might say something that's very complimentary, but because it is about a certain group of people, it's looked at as a bad thing. And that is getting almost to the extreme where people are feeling very hesitant to say anything at all about anybody, complimentary or just maybe even constructive feedback, because we have become so touchy about what people say about us. I can remember years ago, and this would be called bullying now, and it probably was, but because I'm a redhead and there was another redhead in my class, a guy, we were chosen king and queen of sixth grade because we were the most colorful people in the class. Red hair, bright colors. We were pretty colorful. That alone was a stereotype of sorts. And then there were poems made up about us, like, I'd rather be dead than red in the head. Now that would be considered bullying. Back then, it was just the natural way of doing things, and it's gotten to the extreme now where kids just generally doing kid teasing can cross the line pretty quickly. And it really does cross the line pretty quickly. Yes, exactly, Jan. The reason you don't watch the news, because you just feel like you got to go out and step on eggshells. And Tony says social media plays into this. Absolutely. And I'm here to tell you, I know that it's 500% worse than it was when I was growing up as a kid. And there really are mean people out there trying to bully. I get that and I understand that. And on the other hand, there are little girls growing up together making comments to each other that it becomes a major meltdown for a normal interaction with people. Because we are always going to face people that stereotype us. We are always going to face people that interact with us in a way we don't approve of. And at some point, we have to take responsibility for our own interactions as well, don't we? So understand that if you've made a stereotype assumption about older people, younger people, introverts, extroverts, life stage, personalities, whatever it might be, when you see them or when you meet a new person of that group, you are going to be unintentionally, subconsciously looking for something to confirm your belief, unless you're aware of it. And you think to yourself when that person comes in that seems to be an introvert, oh, this person seems to like to be alone, so I'm not going to hang over their shoulder. Or this person likes to chat, so I'm going to spend a few minutes with them. Instead of thinking, oh no, here comes the chatter and here comes this and here comes that. Don't assume that the introvert is aloof and doesn't like people and all those kinds of things like we've been told. try to step back from that and say, okay, my first assumption would be, and it's okay to admit that to yourself, but I'm not going to look for something to confirm that. I'm going to treat this person as an individual. That's our whole point, isn't it? We need to treat them as individuals. Okay, top of page 2. And I told you there were several definitions when I was looking to research this particular program. Another definition of stereotype that is a little bit less judgmental about stereotyping itself is that they are specific traits attributed to people based on group membership. That's a little less harsh than what we said about treating them unfairly. There are specific traits attributed to people based on group membership. Some of them are very innocent. They don't really affect how we feel about a person. And some of them then become more toward the negative side of stereotyping. But I kind of like this definition because, as we mentioned, there are times that stereotyping benefits us. If I am in a city by myself and I get lost and I'm driving down the street and I see somebody walking toward my car, male or female, I'm going to stereotype them as this might not be a good thing, and that will keep me safer. Rather than saying, oh, they're just people, I'll open my door and let them in. Anybody here remember the days we picked up hitchhikers besides me? Just raise your hand real quick. Yes, several of us remember that. Years ago, females used to pick up hitchhikers. They could be driving alone and they would pick up hitchhikers. We don't do that now. The specific trait attributed toward that group then becomes a negative stereotype, but for our safety. So I think I would rather err on the side of safety there, wouldn't you? So those are the kinds of things we need to think about. Specific traits attributed to people based on group membership. What specific trait might be attributed to librarians based on your group membership? Just type one into the chat box. What's a specific trait in a very positive way that might be attributed to librarians based on the fact that you are in the library environment? We aren't shushers anymore. Some of you are. There are still some of those. I went into it. First thing that popped into my mind, Luli, was I went into a program on emotional intelligence probably 3 or 4 years ago. It was out of state, and I was talking to people, and one lady came up at the break, and she crossed her arms. We were talking about customer service and all those kinds of things. She crossed her arms, and she said, I am here to protect the books, which I thought was, I almost had to remove myself for a moment because we were talking about customer service and trying to be more open and not so worried about the physical aspects of our library, but more about service. Exactly, Genevieve. You know a lot of stuff. That is a specific trait attributed to you based on group membership, isn't it? You know a lot of stuff. When people walk in that door, that's a stereotype about you. As Janet says, you have all the answers. That's a positive thing, isn't it? You wouldn't want people to come in. Yes, Tony, you're right. Librarians are seen as progressives. You wouldn't want people to come in and think, well, these people don't know what they're doing. That would be a negative stereotype. So you want that trait attributed to you. So there are some positives to that as well. And I think this particular version of stereotyping can be useful. It's just that, as we said earlier, we need to make sure we don't let it cross over into the negative aspect of stereotyping. I says we often think of race and ethnicity, as I mentioned earlier, as the areas where stereotypes are used, but there are other more subconscious areas as well. We've talked about this, but I want you to think now in terms of, we've talked about this from the standpoint of diversity. When we first started this whole Diversity Discovery Institute, we talked about these different areas, but now I want you to think of it in terms of stereotyping. What do you think of regarding your patrons when you think of, and I hope you'll all be open in the chat box, when you think of older people versus younger people? What are some of the thoughts that come to mind? Maybe subconscious and you don't act on them. I'm sure you don't. But what are the automatic thoughts that come to mind about older versus younger? I see several people typing, so I'm waiting for some responses here. Absolutely, Genevieve. We automatically assume, don't we, that the older patrons may be, and actually usually we assume that they are less tech savvy, don't we? That's just an assumption. Janet says the very old and the very young are actually quite similar. Yes, you're right. We don't always think that way, though, do we? And, oh, that's a great comment, Tony. The older we make the stereotype, they, especially in Florida, right, they must be retired. I live in a retirement community, and when I moved into this community several years ago, I was not old enough technically to live here. My husband was. And everybody assumed that because we had moved into this community, they stereotyped us with the retired people. I jokingly said to my husband one day when I saw the neighbor picking up acorns because we pay for lawn service in our homeowners association fee, and he was picking them up one by one in his yard because he was bored, and I looked at my husband and I said, if you ever see me out there doing that, just shoot me, because that's the stereotype of the retired person, isn't it? And it wasn't something that I wanted to fall into that stereotypical bucket. So we make those assumptions about older versus younger, and those are stereotypes that we're applying to that. In your environment, gender-wise, men and women, what kinds of stereotypes do we put with the gender? Jan says women are emotional. We do often stereotype that, even especially with our coworkers, don't we? And as I said, I'm not sure we're any more emotional, but I think we do tend to show it probably more, sometimes even against our will, if you all are like me, some of the women in the room. And Genevieve says the stereotype is just the opposite for men. They're more aggressive. But a lot of them aren't. And Jen says men are headstrong. It's a stereotype, isn't it? So think about this. As you're typing in these comments, and Tony says female students more likely to approach us, they're more open. They tend to, now see, I stereotype that. But it does feel like they're more open, doesn't it, Tony? It does feel like, and I'm going to put words in Tony's mouth. Tony, please forgive me if I'm wrong. But it seems as if females walk in, they're more open to asking because that's not a crime. And when males walk in, they think they should already have the answers. You know, it's that old joke, the stereotype, about men not looking at a map or asking for directions. That's a stereotype, isn't it? But how do stereotypes come to be? Because a lot of people fit that description. Exactly, Jan. I didn't even see you say that, but yes, men will ask for directions, or men won't ask for directions, and women will, excuse me. And men can fix things. We assume that. Genevieve says men won't ask for help until they're frustrated. Men will just pay the fine, and women question the fine. But you see, and I'm hearing now, thank you very much for being willing to put those things in the chat box, because what we're hearing, and you heard me slip up too, is that is for us truth about every woman or every man. Now we know that. We know that, don't we? Logically in our brain, that not every man or every woman fits any of the things we just typed into the chat box. And yet, because we're in a hurry, or because we have lots of work to do today, when the next female walks in, we are going to stereotype them. When the next man walks in, we are going to stereotype them, unless we leave here today by raising our awareness about how we stereotype. And it's individual for all of us. We all have different ones. We all have different degrees of it. The whole key is to be aware. And when the thought comes into your mind, oh, this guy won't ask for directions and instructions on how to use the copier, he'll just fumble around with it for 30 minutes because he's a guy. When that thought comes into your mind, you need to try to dismiss that and say, how can I help you with the copier? These things can be really complicated. Or there should be, I always tell people when I'm doing something like that, there should be a law that they're all made the same, and that kind of lightens the mood for everybody. But if I make that assumption and that stereotyping, then I'm going to make that person feel uncomfortable about asking because I already decided that they wouldn't. So we get it pretty set in our minds, and that's why I wanted you to think through, what thoughts do you have? You notice many of us have the same kinds of thoughts. Jen said, I've watched men try and put something together without directions and get frustrated when they have to look at the directions. Yes, many, many, many times. And, you know, we've always seen that joke, if all else fails, read directions. And that's usually pointed at men. For many men, unfairly. Because I know other men who will follow it step by step to the point where you want to just say, yeah, we know you have to pick up the screw next. So again, we make those stereotypes, don't we? So we have to be careful about that because they are so natural to us. We do not even realize that we're stereotyping people when they walk in that door or when we're working right beside them. Yes, Aaron, me too. I follow directions and get angry when they don't make sense. Exactly. Or when they are worded in such a way that you have to read them 4 times before you can figure out what somebody's trying to say. The introvert extrovert. What are some of your stereotypes about introverts and extroverts in your work environment? What do you automatically think about an introvert? What do you automatically think about an extrovert? Yes, Janet, we think that introvert is quiet and shy. And here I am right in front of you. I had somebody tell me the other day, looked me right in the eye when I mentioned that I'm a strong introvert, and she said, "You're not an introvert. Don't let anybody tell you that." And I found that amusing because I am very much an introvert, but I am not quiet and I'm not shy, and I hope I'm not a snob anyway. But that's what people assume about me when they tell me when I tell them that I am an introvert. They don't understand why I do what I do, and I even was told years ago that I couldn't possibly be a trainer if I'm an introvert. That's why for many years I thought I must be an extrovert. I'd never read the actual material on it, but society was telling me that because of the fact that I recharge being alone, I don't necessarily need to go out and party with people all of the time. I like to think things through before I speak it out. Society was telling me that I must be an extrovert if I was going to go be a trainer. So that's what we need to think about when we're making these assumptions. And extroverts absolutely are put in the box of being loud and obnoxious sometimes. Tony says introverts are catalogers. I'm probably very happy there, right, Tony? But yes, extroverts are considered loud, brash. We stereotype that. But I know extroverts. I have a friend that's a high extrovert. You would never know it if you didn't know her on a personal level because she's quiet, she's very calm. She can get really excited and she loves to be around people, but she doesn't have that outward appearance of that. So stereotyping those two groups is not fair to either group. Now, you have patrons that you know well enough that you probably suspect whether they're introverts or extroverts. But are you then clumping them with these negative stereotypes that go along with those two descriptions? That's what we want to be careful of. Are you not asking the introvert on the staff to speak at the board meeting because you know they're quiet? You're assuming that they're shy and backward, but shy and backward is more of a social anxiety issue than being an introvert. Up until 2010, and I mentioned this to you if you were in the program, the American Psychological Association or Psychiatry Association, I can't remember which, Psychiatric Association, was trying to get introversion classified as a social anxiety disorder because they felt everybody, if you didn't want to be around people all the time, that you probably had a problem. So that's how much we stereotype people. And I think too, I'm going to have to probably let my Psychology Today magazine lapse because they have gotten very much focused on putting people in boxes. And as much as they will talk about not stereotyping, they have so many little boxes I can't keep track. Introverts and extroverts both have great ideas, don't they, Lily? Because introverts are thinking them through. Extroverts have a lot of great ideas and maybe don't take action on them. That's a natural trait of an extrovert. But we assume that they won't take action on them. And a lot of times, depending on their personality, they want to take control of that idea. So again, we're stereotyping without really realizing who that individual is. If you start studying personalities, introversion, extroversion, emotional intelligence, and then add in all of the other aspects of culture and age and all those things, it gets really deep and interesting to try to understand a human being as an individual. You aren't going to be able to do that with all of your patrons. But you should be able to do some of that with the people you work with, and you should be able to do some of that with the patrons that you interact with on a regular basis so that they feel as if they're treated like an individual and they don't feel as if you've stereotyped them. Thinking, learning, communication styles that I mentioned earlier, the visual, auditory, kinesthetic. What do we normally think about those? Anybody have any comments on that? Those are a little tougher to just throw out there an idea, so I'm going to fill in the blank here for you. The visual person, we're usually thinking that we should show them, But I am a highly visual person, and I also need to not only see it, but I need to do it myself. So from that aspect, if you stereotype me as you can just show me, I may not get it. I still need to actually physically do it like a kinesthetic does. For the auditory person, we assume that we have to speak slowly for them and that we can just tell them something and they will get it. And a lot of auditories do, but some auditories have enough visual in them that they still need to maybe see a map. My husband can memorize directions to Texas, and he'll know where he's going to a hotel. I have to have it on the seat beside me and see it every step of the way. Get on Interstate 75 for 75 miles, get on Interstate 10 for 212. I have to see all that. He's got it in his mind, and I can't do that. The kinesthetic person, we assume, is always touchy-feely. But I know some kinesthetic people that are not that high. They're more kinesthetic than anything, but they're not so high that they want that touchy-feely all the time. So we've stereotyped those into groups as well. So I just wanted to show you all the ways we can stereotype people. If you think about high IQ, what do we assume as a stereotype about people with high IQ? A lot of times we will stereotype them. And again, remember, stereotypes come about because they tend to be, I will say, a majority. That doesn't mean it's 90%. It could be 51%. But that's why they come nerds, Janet said. A lot of times, think about Big Bang Theory. I love watching that show from that perspective. And that is so stereotyped, is it not? One of the complaints I've seen recently in magazines and things is that many of the men on a lot of the comedy shows are shown as being oafs, not involved in their children's lives, things like that. So again, we're stereotyping. And Erin says high IQ always have the answers to everything, like librarians always have the answers to everything. Book smarts versus street smarts, absolutely. I've known people that are almost genius level that can't figure their way out of a wet paper bag. So when people talk about how brilliant they are and they have the answers to everything, I'm thinking to myself, no, they don't. Not necessarily, but we stereotype that. We even stereotype it to the point where we think of them as often being arrogant, don't we? Like Sheldon on Big Bang, if you've ever watched that. And if you never have, if you want to study this stereotyping thing, that would be a great show to watch just one episode of, to see how the writers of the show have stereotyped those highly intelligent people. They've stereotyped the girl next door, who's blonde, by the way, and very attractive and from Nebraska. They've stereotyped her in a specific way. So it really is a study in human beings, and that's one of the reasons I love watching it, because it really gives you a snapshot into how we perceive each other, which is fascinating. And then we also think about the high IQ people, maybe they're out of touch. Yes, but they are changing, Genevieve, you're right. And we can, can't we? When we become aware of some of these things, even Sheldon on that show, who just has no clue what's going on in the world, is starting to be a little more self-aware, which is fun to watch. So the high IQ being arrogant and out of touch with reality and uncaring, we stereotype that, and yet there are some highly intelligent people that are very caring people. You have the Steve Jobs of the world, you have the Bill Gates of the world. If you look at them from an intelligence level and from an ambition level and from a drive level, stepping back, they're similar. But if you've read anything about Steve Jobs and you've read anything about Bill Gates, the stereotype does not fit for both of them. Whatever stereotype you want to pick probably isn't going to fit for both of them, and yet people have probably put them into that box. Geographical background we think of. We think of people from the north being kind of cold, aloof, maybe because it's cold there, I don't know. From the south, we think they're kind of slow, not from a mental standpoint, but of a moving standpoint, that they just don't have a sense of urgency about things, laid back. The east, we think they're kind of brash. I lived in Ohio for most of my life, and even though we were closer to the East Coast people in New York and New Jersey, we even classified Cleveland people in with them because they seemed to have a certain attitude. And so when we would meet somebody from New Jersey, we would automatically stereotype them into that box of being rather brash and abrupt and no sensitivity and those kinds of things. That wasn't true for everybody we met, but it was a natural thing because it's a stereotype. So that's where we would put them. I see Tony's typing, so I want to wait and see if he's typing anything for the chat box here for a second. Tony's been told several times I speak too fast and he's from Connecticut. Yes, exactly. I actually had somebody, Tony asked me, even though I'm from Ohio, I do speak rather quickly. I think that has to do with my visual communication style and my personality. But I had somebody ask me once if I was what part of New York I was from, and I started laughing and I said, "What makes you think that?" And they said, "You speak so quickly." But that was a stereotype, and I'm not from New York, so it really does fit sometimes, doesn't it? And the West, when we think of people from the West, we think they're kind of highly, I'm going to call it left wing, and I'll probably step on somebody's toes. They're left wing and right wing. We all know those stereotypes. But we think of that, don't we? We think of them, let's say, a little maybe gentler word, hippie-ish, if you will, is our natural response. Laid back, yes, absolutely. And outside the USA, we are so ethnocentric, I love that word, about our own environment and our own culture that we think there's nobody else as advanced as us. Well, we're starting to figure out pretty quick that people are surpassing us in many areas, and yet there are a lot of people that will put blinders on regarding that because, after all, we live in the United States of America. And so all of those stereotypes can catch us unaware when we're dealing with our patrons or our coworkers or our supervisors or somebody on the board or whatever it might be. And if we don't watch ourselves, we can commit a faux pas, shall we say, by thinking about that stereotype and treating them in a different way than we should be treating them. Stature, even, is a stereotype. We think of unusually tall people almost subconsciously as being above others, as being different, as being an outcast. We think of unusually short people as being insecure with low self-esteem, that Napoleon complex. Think about that. Have a friend here in Ocala. I haven't seen him for a while now, but he used to be a jockey. So guess what? He's very short. And I got to tell you, when I first met him, I made some stereotypes about him till I got to know him. I stereotyped him as a jockey, which he was, but he's extremely well read, extremely deep thinking. I would not have put him in that category. And part of that was because of his stature, which led him to his profession, and then his profession led to a stereotype. Our upbringing. I hear this a lot. Are you an only child? Are you one of several children? Where is your birth order? We think of only children as what? What do you think of when you think of an only child? You may have some coworkers that are only children. Spoiled. It's our automatic stereotype, isn't it, Jan? And yet some only children have told me that they are actually treated, I won't say harshly, but with higher expectations because they're an only child. Self-centered, absolutely, Genevieve. I was at lunch one day with somebody and I said, would you like to split our entrees so we can both taste them? And she said, I'm an only child. I don't share. And that reiterated my stereotype, didn't it? She didn't say it in a mean way or anything. That was just her thought process. And we think that about an only child. We even sometimes think they're more mature, and many times they are because they've interacted with adults so much of their lives, but it's a stereotype that can get us in trouble when we make the assumption that they're more mature and they're not. One of several children, then, we sometimes think, especially if they're in the middle, they got lost somewhere along the way, didn't they? They may have lower self-esteem because they never became an individual. And those are stereotypes because that does happen when there are several children sometimes. Not always, and that's why we should be careful about the stereotypes. The education, college educated versus no higher education. I put this on here because this was a really sore spot for me for many years. Some of you know I got my first degree in 2011, 3.5 years ago, my first degree. Then I got my MBA in 2013. Before that, I had pretty much all of the knowledge I have now because the college classes I took were necessary for the degrees I got, but didn't really lend themselves to any more additional knowledge for what I do for a living. So it was a very big sore spot when people stereotype me for not having a college degree. I have a state that actually asked for a proposal from me, and because I did not have the college degree, would not consider my proposal. Unknowingly, that state, it wasn't Florida, it was way, way far away. But unknowingly, I've actually done work in that state because library people there have heard me elsewhere and decided I was the one they wanted to do the speaking. but I got stereotyped because I didn't have that college education. And we think college education then helps people lord it over others, or they now have all the answers, or that makes them more qualified. There are lots of stereotypes there, aren't there? And then we think no higher education, they couldn't possibly understand because they don't have a college degree. And you see this reflected in some of the shows that are, well, for instance, Big Bang Theory. Penny doesn't have the degree. I think she might have gone to a community college. Sheldon really zings her. Sheldon zings one of the other fellows on the program because he only has a master's degree. So do you see how those stereotypes fit? And they fit for all of us. That's what makes TV programming successful, is that it represents the real world. When you think about Everybody Loves Raymond and shows like that, there are pieces of it. Now, some of it goes to the extreme, but there are pieces of it that represent everyday life. And they're stereotyped. And that's what makes them successful, because people can relate to them. But in our world of trying to interact with our patrons and trying to give better service and trying to make sure we understand diversity and deal with it very effectively, we need to be more aware of ourselves so that we're not interacting with them based on the stereotypes. Okay, page 3. Now, I hope you've been thinking long and hard about yourself as we're going through this, because pretty soon I'm going to ask you some specific questions that I want you to answer. Top of page 3. Another stereotype, family status. What do we think of with single people? Just type a word or a phrase into the chat box. Stereotyping single people. Carefree. Yes. If that's my Nancy, we think that because we're not. That those people must be carefree. No obligations. Yes, exactly. That's right, Nancy. We know we're not carefree, so we're thinking they must be. Frivolous, sometimes even self-centered, right? And sometimes if it goes on too long, yeah, exactly, Tony. Why can't they commit? What's wrong with them? Isn't that funny? In the beginning of their adult stage, if they're single, we think carefree, no cares in the world, can do anything they want. The longer that goes on, we start to question, is there something wrong with them? Because society has told us in the past, not so much anymore, we're getting quite a ways away from this, but in the past it said we should be with someone. And so we think they can't commit. Married people, sometimes we think, especially for females, we stereotype females who are married as their career is secondary to them. I know 2 people, as I'm sitting here today, where the wife works and the husband doesn't. So obviously that's not necessary. If I know 2, I could probably think harder and come up with another 1 or 2 myself. Then that obviously is not really very true at all anymore. And yet we think that female won't commit because the career takes a second place. We also think, we stereotype by saying, oh, you're married, you have it a lot easier than me because you've got somebody to help you. There you go. Anna says she's one of those. Her partner stays home because he's in school. Very good reason to do that. But if you think married people have it easier because there's somebody there to help, that's not always necessarily true. That person may not be a helper. That person may not contribute as much. There may be other things going on, and we stereotype that. And let's go back to coworkers here. We may stereotype the single people as, well, they can work Thursday night. They don't have anything else going on. Do you hear a stereotype there? Big stereotype, folks. I've had people say this to me. I've had single people come up to me and say, I get tired of being taken advantage of because I'm single. It would be a stereotype, wouldn't it? And scheduling wise, we may do the exact opposite with the married people. If they have young children, well, they can't work at night because they have young kids. That's not really fair to everybody else, is it? Or we might say they can work because they've got a husband at home or a wife at home that can help out with the kids. It can go either way, but it's a stereotype. For widowed people, we think again, no other obligations, or they can't get beyond what happened to them, and so they're not as much of a contributor to us as they could be if they were just married or single. Sometimes we think that. So it can be one of two things. Either we think they don't really have any obligations because that obligation is gone now, or we think that they can't get beyond what they've dealt with and they are no longer of value. All of a sudden we've put them into a different category. Often in the libraries we talk about different buckets of money. I think there are different buckets of categories of life that we put people in as well. Divorced people, if they don't have any kids, not a real big issue, except again, we kind of throw them into the single pot. We wonder why they got divorced. There are lots of things. Is there something wrong here? If they have children and they're divorced, or if they're not, then we think that they're not committed to the job. They're going to drop everything for their kids, all those kinds of things. It's a stereotype. Certainly if their kids are sick or something like that, they should drop everything. But sometimes we stereotype them that any little thing, the kids will take precedence. If they don't have children, single, married, widowed, or divorced, if that person doesn't have children, we stereotype them as not having any empathy for those people who do. We stereotype them by thinking they are put upon by expectations not filled by those with children. So those people with children put expectations on them. We want them to work longer hours because they don't have those obligations. So think about this when you're thinking about your coworkers. I'm not going to ask anybody to show hands. I'm not going to ask anybody to put in the chat box, but have any of you ever experienced, you might be the one that experienced it, where there were higher expectations because that person was single or didn't have anybody to be obligated to when they got home. It happened. So think about that, because remember I talked about those retention issues. If stereotyping is too prevalent, that's one of the things that pops up. They felt they were being treated differently than the people who were married or had families because of the stereotype of not having any obligations. And yet often single people are in school, or they have volunteering obligations, or they're helping out with something else, or whatever it is. They have obligations too, and whether or not they do doesn't really have anything to do with what the job expectation has, does it? Sure, we're going to work with people, we're going to be flexible, but if you think about two groups of people, let's say married with children and single with no children, why should we expect the single with no children person to put more into the job, to be available more hours, those kinds of things? Not really fair, is it? It's a stereotype, thinking that they have nothing else in their lives, and even if they have nothing in their lives, we should not make the assumption that they are willing to be used, I'm going to say, because the expectation is different for them than the person who's married or has children. Now, again, we all have to be flexible with schedules. We all should be willing to do what we can when the schedule changes, when we need help, those kinds of things. But to have that stereotyped image where that person is expected to do or be a certain way is not fair to them. Another area is the personality. You've heard me talk about this. I use the Wired That Way personality profile by Marita and Florence Littauer. It's been around for, I think, 40 to 45 years. It's very similar to DISC. It's very similar to the foundation of the Myers-Briggs. The Myers-Briggs goes in a lot of different directions, but much of the research for all of the I won't say all of, many of the main personality profiles that are out there, much of the research remains the same. They've all researched the same materials, the same historical information, and so forth. But when you think about popular people who love people, who are charming, who are very outgoing, almost always extroverts, what's a stereotype you make about popular people in your library, coworker or patron? What's a stereotype you make about that person? Fake. Tony says we just automatically assume it because they're so out there. They're so on all the time, right? So we make a stereotype about them that we never are sure if they're sincere. Anna says we assume that they're happy at home. It's a stereotype. Lots of popular people aren't not because, but that's one of the reasons they go out and they show more exuberance when they're out, because that's how they get their recharging. Yes, look at Robin Williams. That's a stereotype for people that we assume should be happy. We've put them into this popular, charming, people-oriented, outgoing person, We assume that they're all about the fun, don't we? Yes, Nancy, exactly. If you've ever been a supervisor, if you have a popular working for you, you think of them, you stereotype them as too busy talking to do their work. I was really guilty of this in my corporate job when I was very young. It wasn't somebody that even worked directly for me, but she was highly popular. And I can remember thinking, does she ever do any work? And as I started studying this, I always go back to my corporate job and kind of dissect things that happened there to see if they apply in what I'm studying. And one of the things I realized was that she was fairly productive. She just needed constant interaction with people. I don't. So I never understood that. And I made stereotypes about her because of my opposite way of behaving. Populars sometimes we think are schmoozers, don't we? Brown nosers, we used to call them. That they're always in and among the movers and shakers and getting the attention and taking the credit and all those kinds of things. Not necessarily true. I have friends that are populars that have learned that about themselves, and they work in their strengths. When we're thinking about the powerful person who loves to be in control, who wants to take charge, who looks at the big picture, what might be a stereotype that we think about that powerful person in our workplace? Coworker or patron? What might be the stereotype? One of them. There are many. Machiavellian, absolutely, Tony. They're just going to get there, aren't they? The end justifies the means. Got to get her done. Jan says, and they're unapproachable. Disconnected with reality, Lily says. They see the big picture, but they don't necessarily see the people or the details. And it's a stereotype, but it's a stereotype because often it's true. Remember, we talked about that. That's why they're stereotypes. There are strengths and weaknesses for both of these. The key being to understand that if people are aware of themselves, they're working mostly in their strengths, and those stereotypes may very well be true, but we can't assume that all of the time. A powerful person, we may make the stereotype that powerful people are going to take charge, so I don't have to. But if they're not working in their strengths, the powerful person may just create problems, not take charge. They may be resentful that somebody else has a higher title or more money, and so instead of trying to be in control and taking charge, they're in control by causing trouble. We've all known people like that, haven't we? Where, boy, if they would just focus on the good stuff, they could take that powerful personality and really get some things done, but they're using it to a negative side. It's a stereotype. How about the perfect person, the genius-prone person that's very analytical, very detail-oriented, loves the specifics, loves to get it right? What's a stereotype about that person? By the way, this is the most prevalent personality style in the industry, in the library field, is the perfect melancholy. From my experience, and I've given this test hundreds of times in the last 15 years to people in the library field, and the most prevalent style is perfect melancholy. The second most prevalent is peaceful. But what's a stereotype we make about the perfect? No empathy. It's all about the rules, isn't it, Tony? They have to be right. That's why they want everything perfect. Now, those stereotypes, again, come by us because they can be very true. But if you think about it, if a perfect knows they have a tendency to dwell too long on something, they get to a point where they can say, it's okay, it's very good, it may not be perfect, but it's very good. So the stereotype is not always true. I think, too, one of the big stereotypes we do for perfects is that they're rigid. But are librarians rigid nowadays? They can't be, can they? They can. Yes, they can be in reality, but as a job, the librarian job has morphed so much and morphs so much faster now that if a perfect melancholy goes into the library field so that they never have to change, they're going to be sorely disappointed. So nowadays, the perfect melancholies that may have fit into that stereotype 10, 15 years ago are learning themselves that they no longer can sit there and be rigid, and this is the rule, and this is the way we've always done it. They have to be able to change more quickly than they used to, and so they've manage to maybe rid themselves of a little bit of that stereotype, but we still maybe perceive them as being very rigid. This is my secondary style. Yes, Genevieve, some still try, absolutely. I'm right there with you. This is my secondary, and this is the tendency that I have, especially about rules and procedures and what's fair. Perfects have a very strong sense of fairness. And if the rule says this, and these three people have to abide by it, but that person doesn't, they are more highly upset probably than the other three styles. The popular is just saying, so what? The powerful is going to control it and make sure they get what they want, and the peaceful doesn't care either. And so the perfect is sitting there mulling it over, getting highly upset, getting very stressed out by it because the rules weren't followed. When I talk to people about customer service in the library field, we often get hung up on the rule is. So I ask them to take a step back and say, okay, is the rule the right rule? Or is it just for the convenience of the library? Or is it just because we developed it in 1999 and we've never looked at it to see if it's still appropriate? And the perfects get very hung up on it. They're the ones that cross their arms and say, this is the way we've always done it. As in, we are not going to change, nor do we have to. You can't make me, kind of a thing. So the perfect has their stereotype, and the peaceful has a stereotype of being lazy. Lots of peacefuls I know aren't lazy, but they are very laid back. And they really don't tend to get highly excitable about much of anything. And so therefore we think they don't have a lot of ambition, they don't have a lot of initiative, that we also think we can run right over them. But my caution to you is if you stereotype the peacefuls in your environment as a doormat, you may find that they end up being a tea kettle and they boil over at some point. So be careful about that. So again, those are the kinds of things that we lump people into these areas that make it very convenient for us to process our thoughts about them. But too convenient, because sometimes it's not true, or it's not true to the extent that we've attributed to them. So we've got to be careful about that. Here's another one I added just because I think we can get way off base on this. What are some of our stereotypes about homeschoolers? What do we sometimes stereotype about them? Yes, exactly, Luli. I was thinking of unsocialized, but you said it very well. Socially awkward. But I know some that are actually very, very comfortable in their own skin. I'm thinking of a certain interaction I have with a professional. He has 7 children. They're homeschooled, and I have met the oldest 4, and the oldest 2 I have met in actually a working environment, very mature, very personable, very easy to talk to, totally different than what I would have thought. So we kind of think of them as unsocialized, not really up to speed on what they're supposed to be learning educationally, maybe a little bit lazy, all of those things. Be careful of that in your library. If you have people that are coming in as homeschoolers, you may get to know them enough that you can put the stereotype aside, but it's easy to fall into that trap, isn't it? And society definitely feels like they're outside looking in at the homeschoolers, or vice versa, but they definitely feel like there's a barrier there, don't they? In general, society in general, many people will be very, I'm just going to use the word judgmental about the stereotype that is presented to them about homeschoolers without ever even knowing any homeschoolers. Are there some that are socially awkward? No doubt. Are there some that are left behind because mom just thought that might be an easy way to do it and she really doesn't pay attention? And I'm going to use mom because that's the one that usually stays home and homeschools. And I'm stereotyping. Do you see how easy it comes out of my mouth? It's because we do that. I'm sure there are lots of men that stay home and homeschool their kids. But we stereotype that. And Lily says it's true of some that go to school as well, that they don't interact well with people. So homeschooling really is not the defining factor there. It's the kind of person that's doing the homeschooling, it's the level of intelligence, it's the level of ambition, it's all of those kinds of things, and yet we say because they're homeschoolers, they are XYZ as a stereotype. And that's where our awareness of the diversity of differences in our library environments comes in at such a critical point to make sure we understand that you could line up 100 homeschoolers from 100 different families, and every one of them would be at a different spot on the continuum of social awkwardness. Every one of them would be at a different spot on the continuum of, even if they're all in the same quote grade level, of how they're doing academically, how they're doing with ambition and drive and character and all those kinds of things that they're supposed to be being taught when they're homeschooled. So just a good thing to be aware of with that particular group. Jay says, how can we decrease stereotypes in our workplace? That's what it's all about, isn't it? We're not going to eliminate them, I don't think. I mean, that would be the ultimate goal, but gosh, I'm pretty realistic, as most of you know, and I understand that we are human. And as much as I talk about these kinds of things, it still slips out in my conversation because my thought process still goes to a certain stereotype about certain groups. So how do we decrease that to some extent? Number one says focus on team building to build relationships. Focus on getting to know your coworker at a different level. Focus on working with a team where you each use your own strengths, no matter what category you may fall into. Maybe the strength of somebody that you would have thought would have been working with kids is actually more cataloging, or vice versa. But focus on team building to build relationships. Focus on team building even with your patrons so that you understand your goal is to have a happy patron when they leave. Their goal is to have a happy patron. The less you stereotype, the more you can decrease what you're thinking of that patron when they walk in, the more likely they're going to be happy when they leave. Let me give you a real life example real quick. I was in to have my car serviced the other day. And because I do, or MLC director, yes. Absolutely, Erin. The more I travel, I'm doing a lot of traveling, and I've got a lot of traveling coming up this fall and into next year. And so I want a car under warranty. I didn't used to buy new cars, but I do now because I travel alone as a female, and it's a little scary world out there. So I'm looking at getting a different car next year. My car will be 5 years old and out of warranty. So when I took my current car in for servicing to the dealer where I got it, there is another model that I like of that particular brand, if you will. And so my car was there for servicing. I walked around the lot a little bit when I went to pick it up. And somebody greeted me. They were very nice. And then he turned me over to a salesperson. And I was very honest. I said, I'm not quite ready yet, but here's my plan. I'll be trading in this, da-da-da-da-da-da. This person dismissed me automatically. And the person was a female. It was a female salesperson, but very dismissive. Took my name and phone number, but didn't ask me what features I was looking for, how long I've had my current car, nothing to qualify me as a potential buyer. And I told my husband about it when I got home, and he said, do you suppose they thought your husband had to be with you to make a decision? And I said, I think you're right. Even though it was a female salesperson, I think she stereotyped me. And also, they didn't know what car I had brought in at that point, but another lady had gotten out of a car that said Grow Financial on it, and it's a company that is a financial investment firm kind of a place, and they thought I was that person. So apparently, because I wasn't with that financial person or financial company, maybe I didn't qualify for a new car or whatever it might have been. But when I got the survey to fill out about my service experience, I added a comment about that. And I said, here's what happened. And my last statement was, it may have been a missed opportunity. I don't want you to miss opportunities in your library to make happy patrons. And if you're stereotyping, as we all do, and you're not aware of it and you continue to do it, you've missed some chances, haven't you? You've missed some opportunities to create a happy library patron because you treated them like the unique individual they are. So team building applies not only with your coworkers, your supervisor, people you work with, people who work for you, if you're a supervisor, manager, a leader, but also with the people you're building relationships with who come in to use your services. Increase awareness of stereotyping and appreciate diversity. When we talked about energizing your workplace with diversity, that's what we talked about. All of the positives that come from all of these different aspects of an individual, not the stereotype. Yes, there's some benefit to knowing how that group would normally react or whatever, but to understand the diversity of every person that walks in your door. That's what we're talking about here. 3 says, develop your ability to express empathy. Here's the deal. If the stereotype we have of someone is totally opposite of who we are, it's harder for us to have empathy, isn't it? Because we're all egocentric. I talked about being ethnocentric earlier, which is about our culture and our country and so forth. But we all have some egocentric attributes, if you will, which is about us. It's all about me. Isn't everybody like me? Isn't everybody a powerful choleric? Isn't everybody an introvert? Isn't everybody a whatever I am? So I need to understand that people who are different than me are going to react to the world differently than I do. And I need to develop empathy to deal with that. And I'm going to be very transparent with you today. This has been a struggle for me that has been highly accelerated as far as improvement by doing training on it. Because I've had to learn about it, research it, my self-awareness has become so much higher. That's what I'm hoping to help you with, is your self-awareness today, so that anybody that's different than you, it doesn't matter how, race, culture, ethnicity, gender, age, life stage, all of the things we've talked about, can you develop some empathy for them? It doesn't mean you have to agree with their lifestyle. It doesn't mean you have to agree with their attitude. It just means that you are going to put yourself in their place, no matter how different it is than your place, and try to have some empathy. That helps you deal with those stereotypes. That even though I see somebody that's totally different than me and may secretly think, gosh, I'm glad I am who I am and I have this trait myself, that doesn't mean I shouldn't have empathy for them, because you know what? They're probably thinking the same thing about me. Gosh, I'm glad I'm not like her. And I hope they would extend some empathy. Yes, Ernestine, I have a different number 3 question. What is that? Oh, you do, don't you? I just noticed that. I don't know what happened with that. Well, number 3 was keep an open mind. I don't know where it went. Thank you, Ernestine. I got to go back and look at that. That's odd because I copy and paste right from the handouts onto the slide, so I'm going to have to check that out. Thank you, Ernestine. So the answer to number 3 is actually keep an open mind, which is part of the number 3 you would see then to have empathy. That should actually be number 4 on your screen. Obviously, my perfect melancholy was not playing that day. Yes, thank you for being attentive. I will get that corrected as soon as we're done here. The key word, forget that number up there, under develop your ability to express empathy, is develop, isn't it? The whole key word for everything we've talked about in this series so far is about you developing your ability to do that, to express yourself as an individual and understand other people, to understand different values, to energize your workplace. It's all about you developing that, to develop a higher level of respect for people, to develop your ability to express empathy and your awareness of stereotypes, to develop the open mind that Ernestine was kind enough to call our attention to. Number 4, which is actually number 5 for us, is to intentionally learn about those who are different than you. The more intentional you are about those kinds of things, the higher your awareness is and the higher your level of self-management is. And we have to have all of those things to overcome the stereotypes that automatically pop into our heads. Okay, here are the questions that I was telling you about. The first question is, what have you thought about today regarding stereotypes that you hadn't given much thought to before? Would you jot yourself a note there and type it in the chat box if you would? I'm going to read that statement that's up in front of you while you're thinking and writing, and I know that's a little bit of a distraction, but I loved this when I saw it. Strong moral arguments exist for why we should often try to ignore stereotypes or override them, but we shouldn't assume they represent some irrational quirk of the unconscious mind. In fact, they're largely the consequence of the mind's attempt to make a rational decision. Yes, exactly. We miss an opportunity, don't we, when we aren't paying attention. So let's not say today we're going to override them or ignore them. Let's say we're going to be aware of them and use them to our benefit. Because as we talked right at the beginning, sometimes it is a benefit. Nancy says, I never thought about stereotypes, but realized that I do that. I don't know anybody, I shouldn't say that. I don't know what other people think, but I really highly suspect that everybody experiences them to some degree. So let's not Let's not try to beat ourselves up and say we're going to ignore them completely. We're going to override them. I'm never going to have them again. But let's say, okay, I have this stereotype. Let's use that to make a decision. Jan says I'm going to be more aware of how I look at individuals. We don't always look at them as individuals, do we, Jan? That's the whole thing about stereotypes. We lump them into the group, and it's as if the whole crowd of introverts just walked in our front door because that particular person happens to be an introvert. We attribute all of the qualities of an introvert to that particular person, even though there may be some that they may not have. Understanding stereotyping that stereotyping others is something most of us do, whether consciously or unconsciously. What stereotypes might you want to work on after today? You don't need to tell me in the chat box because this is very personal, but I do want you to write something down for yourself. Code it if you need to. Put some kind of a little clue there if you're a little embarrassed by it or wish you didn't have that stereotype, because sometimes we do, don't we? We have certain stereotypes about certain groups that we would rather not have. So if that's something you need to work on, write it down on this sheet of paper. How might you become more aware of your tendencies to stereotype, and what are you going to do about that? How are you going to become more aware? Hopefully this webinar raised your awareness exponentially, that you now are really aware of stereotypes and how they come into your mind. The last question is just for you. If you've got somebody in your life that might hold you accountable, might be good to write them down and tell them about this webinar when you're done today. That if you start to say something about a group of people that appears as a stereotype, that you will allow them to nudge you a bit and say, are you stereotyping? And is that a positive? Sometimes we know it is. It's okay to do that. It's a benefit. It's what you need to do to get your job done well. It's what you need to do to make a good decision. But is it being done in a negative way? That would be the person that holds you accountable. They can help you with that. Well, I hope you've had as much fun as I have today, and I hope you've increased your self-awareness, and I hope you'll leave here today with a determination to increase your self-management now that you're more aware. And if you have any questions for me, you can always just drop me an email, and I'm more than happy to give you some objective feedback about it. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. I look forward to seeing you in a future session.
And thank you, Linda, for a wonderful webinar. We're very lucky to have you be able to participate in this learning opportunity. Some great information, a sneak peek of what's coming up. Attendees would like to remind you that on Friday, May 8th, we have the 7th in the series of the 9 webinars for diversity. May 8th webinar is entitled I is for Inclusivity in the Workplace Culture. This webinar will be presented by Dr. Bob Bidding, and we hope you can join us for that one. Also up in May, May 6th is our library staff day. I know many of you are signed up, so we look forward to seeing you. It's going to be a great day. We also have Dr. Karen Snow coming for a cataloging workshop. She will be doing cataloging troublesome stuff, or as Lily likes to call it, cataloging icky stuff. We also have our book repair workshops coming up in May. And finally, part 2 of patron-driven acquisitions, Who Gets to Choose? Another great cataloging webinar presented by Dr. Naomi Gold. Feel free to sign up for any of those webinars and or workshops whenever you'd like, hopefully soon, so we can get everything ready for you. And I hope everyone has a great weekend.